Bruce Banner has a relatively small direct family. It happens when your best party trick is turning into a gamma-irradiated green ball of rage. But through his time in Marvel Comics, he has accumulated quite the roster of human, alien, and gamma-mutated companions. Today on Top 10 Nerd, I'm going to attempt to explain the Hulk family tree. Starting off with the One Below All. The One Below All is the dark side and a part of the same being known as the One Above All, who is the supreme ruler of the multiverse and the supreme embodiment of creation and compassion, which would make the One Below All the ultimate personification of destruction and hate. It resides in the lowest point of reality, called the Below Place, from which it rules. Sealed off from the rest of the multiverse through the metaphysical green doors, it manifests in other realities through extreme gamma, which is the mutagenic third form of gamma radiation. This radiation is what creates gamma mutates based off the individual's genetic and psychological makeup. Before we move on though, hey guys, if you're enjoying this channel, dropping a like is all you have to do to help us out. We would really appreciate it. But now, on to the man himself, Bruce Banner. Incredible Hulk #1 from 1962 introduced Dr. Robert Bruce Banner to the Marvel Universe and gave us the very first gamma mutate. During a routine test of the gamma bomb he developed, Bruce spotted a teenager named Rick Jones in the blast radius and he took it upon himself to save Rick's life. He succeeded, but his bomb's explosion opened the first green door, which is a metaphysical barrier into the Below Place, and infused him with gamma radiation, turning him into the Grey Hulk. Now over time, Hulk's skin eventually turned green, thanks to some real-world mix-ups, and he became more childlike. In Incredible Hulk #377, the Green and Grey Hulks merged with Bruce to become a new incarnation, Professor Hulk. But these three different incarnations of Hulk are just a few of the personalities that live in Bruce's fractured mind, and not all of them are good people. On to Bruce's family, starting with Brian Banner and Rebecca Banner. While Bruce is naturally the core figure in this family tree, the roots of the Hulk's rage come from his father, Brian Banner, and without him, there would honestly be no Hulk. If there's a villain in this story, it's Brian. He physically and emotionally mistreated his wife Rebecca Banner and their son. As seen in Incredible Hulk #312 from 1968, Brian became deeply disturbed and obsessed with the idea that his radiation research had turned his son Bruce into a monster. Brian was even responsible for the passing of Rebecca in front of Bruce, which led directly to the development of multiple personalities for Bruce and the Hulk. Years later, during the Chaos War, Brian actually emerged on Earth as a fearsome devil Hulk of his own before he was defeated and returned to the afterlife. More recently though, Brian made a lot of trouble in Immortal Hulk as a servant of the One Below All, and he even gained the ability to possess other gamma-infected human beings. Now Brian Banner himself had two sisters, but the one we want to talk about is Elaine Banner Walters and her husband Morris Walters. Their daughter, the lawyer Jennifer Walters, is Bruce Banner's first cousin and probably the closest thing he has to a sibling. It just so happened that as Bruce was seeking legal aid from Jennifer, she was nearly killed during an assassination attempt. Bruce saved her life by giving her an emergency blood transfusion, but as a result, she became the She-Hulk. Although she started out as a bit of a savage She-Hulk when she first appeared on issue 1 of her comic in 1980, Jen's personality eventually became dominant when she was in her gamma-powered form. In fact, she actually prefers being She-Hulk and put her skills to use as an Avenger and member of the Fantastic Four at one point. In case you've missed any of the ads, she is also the focus of the MCU's She-Hulk attorney at law. Now the first love of Bruce's life was Betty Ross, the daughter of General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross. Betty and her father both actually became Hulks as well. For Betty, the villain MODOK realized that her exposure to Bruce Banner set her up as an ideal subject to become a new Hulk. In Incredible Hulk #168 from 1968, Betty was transformed, but not into another She-Hulk. Instead, she actually turned into a terrifying Harpy, who hated the Hulk for the passing of her husband at the time, Glenn Talbot. Betty was soon cured of her Harpy persona, but she was ultimately killed by exposure to access gamma radiation by the Abomination. Fortunately for her though, MODOK and the Intelligentsia resurrected Betty and she became the Red She-Hulk. However, in the Immortal Hulk series, Betty once again has been transformed into the Red Harpy. I hope that wasn't too confusing. Now, as for her father, no one hated Bruce Banner more than Betty's father, General Thunderbolt Thaddeus Ross, a military general who became obsessed with stopping the Hulk at any cost. That's why it took everyone by surprise when Ross actually turned out to be the Red Hulk, who is a fiery and power-draining gamma mutate. Ross made the mistake of partnering with the intelligentsia, who tricked him and turned him into the Red Hulk, using energy siphoned off of the original Hulk. Ross embraced his newfound Hulk powers, proving to be an incredibly powerful and capable hero. Bruce and Ross eventually did make an alliance to take down the intelligentsia, and Red Hulk was actually invited to join the Avengers. Ross was eventually depowered, but as of Captain America number 26 from 2018, he is once again the Red Hulk. Now, when the Hulk was banished from Earth by the Illuminati during Planet Hulk, he crash-landed on the planet Sakaar, which is where the Hulk met his second wife, Kaira. Although Kaira appeared to die in the destruction of Sakaar, she actually gave birth to Bruce/Hulk's first children, Sakaar and Hero Kala. Sakaar became an incredibly powerful warrior with a vendetta against his father, but thankfully Sakaar and Bruce reconciled before becoming a formidable father and son team. Unfortunately for Hero Kala, his taste for power and vengeance corrupted him, and he also nearly destroyed the Earth in Incredible Hulk's number 617, before his father and brother sealed Hero Kala within the center of an alien planet. Hulk's other daughter is a bit trickier to explain. The short version is that Lyra is a daughter of the Hulk and Thundra from the alternate future timeline of Earth 715, where only 5% of the female population were fertile. Hulk and Thundra were never actually a couple. Instead, Thundra collected the Hulk's DNA from his saliva during a fight and immediately traveled back to her alternate future, where she used that DNA to create Lyra, who is basically a She-Hulk, and actually gets weaker the angrier she gets instead of stronger, meaning she has to reach a meditative state to reach peak power. Now, Lyra eventually came to live in the present alongside the Hulk, Jennifer Walters, and her extended Hulk family. Finally, in terms of Hulk romances, we have Jarella, the princess of the subatomic kingdom of Kai. She was never married to the Hulk or Bruce, but she loved both halves of him very much, and he also loved her. Their bond was so important that Jarella definitely is included on this list, despite the fact that she tragically passed away before they could wed. From Hulk's actual family to those who are essentially his family by association, his friends and allies, starting with none other than Rick Jones. If not for Bruce's timely rescue, Rick Jones could have been the first Hulk, but instead, he was spared from that fate and became one of Bruce Banner's closest and most trusted friends. In Incredible Hulk number 325 in 1962, Rick did actually get a little taste of Hulk power when he fell into a chemical pool that was being used to merge Bruce and the Hulk back into a single being once again. Rick emerged as a Hulk, but he was cured a few chapters later in issue number 332. It wouldn't last long though, as thanks to the meddling of the intelligentsia yet again, Rick was mutated into a new version of Abomination in Hulk number 2 in 2008. As this new Abomination, Rick actually retained most of his personality, and so he renamed himself A-Bomb so he could be a bit more heroic, which was a good choice, Rick. Good job. Rick was also horrendously mutated in Immortal Hulk before his humanity was finally restored in the limited series Gamma Flight from 2021. Doc Sasquatch, or Doc Samson. Doc Samson is one of the few members of the Hulk/Gamma family who willingly transformed himself. It happened in Incredible Hulk number 141 in 1962 when Bruce Banner was temporarily cured of his Hulk persona by removing the excess radiation from his body. Samson couldn't resist taking that power for himself, but he wasn't turned into a full Hulk. Instead, he was given superhuman strength and a striking head of green hair, likely due to his psychological makeup with him wanting to be a hero. In Immortal Hulk, Doc Samson got trapped in the below place and instead resurrected into the body of Walter Lankowski, also known as Sasquatch. He then became a green-haired version of the Sasquatch. Despite his great strength, Samson's greatest contribution to the Marvel Universe has been in actually as a therapist for heroes and villains in need. During the event World War Hulk, Amadeus Cho was one of the few heroes who stood by the Hulk in his battle against the Illuminati. This was fueled by Amadeus's unshakable assertion that the Hulk is actually a hero and not a monster. Now, years later, in Totally Awesome Hulk #1 from 2015, Amadeus got his wish to become a Hulk as well. As revealed in issue #4, Amadeus absorbed the excess gamma radiation from Bruce, saving his life while transforming Amadeus in the process. It was a burden that he was more than happy to accept. However, not even Amadeus's intellect and personality could keep the negative aspects of being a Hulk at bay forever. After briefly losing control of his other self, Amadeus willingly depowered himself, but he still retains a significant amount of gamma powers as an agent of Atlas. The Juggernaut, Agamemnon, Glenn Talbot, the Red King, MODOK, Ravage, Wendigo, the UFOs, with a special shout out to Absorbing Man, are all villains that come into conflict with the Hulk. We have already talked about his longest lasting foe, Thunderbolt Ross, or the Red Hulk, but what about his other big bads? Starting with probably the most iconic of the Incredible Hulk's rogues gallery is the one and only Abomination. A dark mirror image of the Hulk, former soldier Emil Blonsky becomes the monstrous Abomination in an attempt to stop the Hulk, being mutated by a gamma machine that was created by Bruce Banner. On countless occasions, Abomination has taken on the Hulk in a one-on-one match. While he's lost time and time again, there have been times where he did give the Hulk a run for his money and even took down the people Hulk loves and cares for. Abomination makes for a fantastic villain, and there's a reason Marvel keeps bringing him back. For someone like the Hulk, a villain with higher intelligence is far greater than someone with equal strength. Samuel Stearns was once a normal man who was exposed to a high level of gamma radiation just like mostly everyone else. The radiation gave him increased intelligence, a really big head, literally, and turned him into the leader. A foe who has time and time again outsmarted and worked around the likes of the Hulk. The leader's almost always 5 steps ahead of Bruce Banner and manages to bring the Hulk down despite his immense strength. And lastly, it honestly makes sense that the most terrifying foe for the Incredible Hulk is actually himself. While the Abomination can be seen as a dark reflection of the Hulk, the Maestro is literally a future evil version of himself. Coming from one of the comic's best Hulk story arcs, Future Imperfect, the Maestro is the last hero who survived an apocalypse and set himself to become the ruler of dystopia. Stronger than his past self and with all the intelligence of Bruce Banner, the Maestro has proved himself to be the strongest and most brutal Hulk villain out there.
Spider-Man is one of the most popular superheroes on the planet. You know him, you know his abilities, but do you know where he came from and who surrounds him on his family web? Welcome in, Nerd Squad. It's me, Amanda. Join me today as we explore the family tree of Spider-Man, discussing his children, his secret sister, and more. Which family tree should we do next? Where are Spider-Man's parents? While Spider-Man was raised by his aunt and uncle from a young age, his actual parents were Richard and Mary Parker. Richard grew up in New York City and Queens and was actually the much younger brother of Ben Parker, who would of course become a guiding light for Peter as he started out as a young hero, with Ben's loss instilling in Peter the famous motto, "Great power comes great responsibility." Richard was a secret agent working for the CIA, who in fact was brought into the fold by none other than the original Nick Fury. Mary herself was also a secret agent working for the CIA, and both her and Richard often went on missions together, working side by side. They were killed after being found out when they were working as double agents, attempting to infiltrate an Algerian spy ring. The finisher was the one who ultimately did the deed, but was ordered to do so by Red Skull after the Red Skull learned of their true allegiances. Spider-Man's secret sister? While Uncle Ben and Aunt May have each played major roles in Peter's life, before we move on to them, I want to talk about his potential secret sister, Teresa Parker. Oh yeah, Spider-Man has a secret sister. Or does he? Teresa Parker, as we'd come to know her through the comics, was at time believed to be the daughter of Richard and Mary Parker, who they actually had in secret. Because of her birth being kept a secret, she was therefore not raised alongside her brother Peter under the care of Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but instead, she was adopted. Years later, like her father, she too would be recruited into the CIA by Nick Fury. To put it mildly, her origin is confusing. Even for Teresa, she struggled to find the real truth of her parentage. While there are clues that have led her to believe she herself is a Parker, it's possible that she was simply manipulated into thinking this by external villainous forces. It's also possible that her parents were simply shapeshifters impersonating Richard and Mary, and there's actually stuff in Teresa's life that has led us to believe that, which has also been, suggested and implied in the comics, so that could be a possibility. However, regardless of her true origin, after her adventures with Spider-Man, Teresa decided to reject all other alternative origins that were offered and instead see herself as a Parker, regardless of whether or not she was actually the birth daughter of Richard and Mary. So even if she isn't actually blood related to Peter, she isn't actually the true sister of him, to Teresa, she'll always see herself as his sister. Uncle Ben and Aunt May's origins. Benjamin Parker was the much younger brother of Richard Parker. When he was younger, he fell for one of the prettiest women around, May Riley. However, at the time, having spent most of her life struggling financially, she was attracted to another man who she believed could give her a life of comfort and adventure during a time when economically many were actually struggling. However, Ben came to help May realize the truth about her suitor at the time, Johnny Jerome, who was actually a criminal. After realizing the truth about Johnny and grieving the loss of her first love, May actually began to fall for Ben, and really, the rest is kinda history. Although the couple's life together wouldn't always be easy, and they would still have their own arguments, even almost breaking up multiple times, ultimately their life together was still one filled mostly with happiness and with a lot of love. They were married and did attempt to start having a family, but health complications prevented them from doing so. While his brother Richard and his sister-in-law Mary were killed in the line of duty working for the CIA as undercover agents, Ben and May had been looking after Peter, and actually ended up adopting him after they learned what had happened to the young couple. 3 become 2. While Aunt May would eventually become Peter's rock in his life, initially she was reluctant in her role as his parental figure and basically his adoptive mother. Ben, however, was quick to warm up to Peter and easily transitioned into the role of a father figure for the young boy. And while May thought back to her own childhood and how her parents had blamed her birth for the trouble between them, she would also eventually warm up to Peter. Instead of Peter driving a wedge between Ben and May, adopting him and taking him in actually had the opposite effect for them, strengthening their bond and their love for one another. Tragically, Ben would be ripped from both May and Peter shortly after the young Parker first manifested his spider-like powers. It was actually Ben's loss that gave Peter more motivation to act as a superhero, teaching him that with great power comes great responsibility. With the loss of Ben, May would once again be forced to struggle financially, prompting Peter to get a job at the Daily Bugle as a photographer to help support his aunt. However, this also caused May to worry about her young nephew, as she initially did not know that he was also secretly the superhero Spider-Man, although of course she would come to know that. Who are Peter's grandparents? Did you know that Peter is actually the second of his name? Technically, we should call him Peter Parker II. His grandfather on his dad's side was also a Peter. He and his wife Anne had their names recorded in a copy of the Daily Bugle in 1939, where the birth of their firstborn son, Ben, was announced. Peter and Anne Parker would of course become parents to not just Peter's famous Uncle Ben, but also his father, Richard Parker, as the two are brothers. We don't know much about Mary's parents either, Peter's maternal grandparents. However, we do know that Mary was mainly raised by her father, William Fitzpatrick, whose wife tragically died quite young. Her name is, as of yet, still unknown to us. The former wife of Spider-Man. Did you know that Peter Parker was actually married? There's a whole bunch of stuff there. It's true. As time progressed in the comics, Peter would grow up, going through high school and college, and eventually settling down with his love, Mary Jane Watson. Prior to this, one of Peter's greatest loves was actually Gwen Stacy, and even after marrying Mary Jane, Peter still often thought of Gwen, who died young at the hands of his foe, Green Goblin. Although as Spider-Man, Peter had actually tried to save Gwen, he ultimately failed to do so, and some actually even consider her death his fault, as the tension of his web is believed to have actually caused Gwen's neck to snap. Although Green Goblin has claimed before that the sheer shock of the fall for Gwen would have basically killed her, and that she was already dead by the time his web would have reached her. Why am I mentioning all this in a part of the video where I'm meant to be talking about Peter's wife? Well, because there are alternate worlds and realities where Peter does actually end up with Gwen. In the House of M reality, the two of them settled down together and even had a son, and I think part of Peter always wonders what his life would have been like had Gwen lived. However, Mary Jane was also friends with Gwen and also felt her loss. I also feel like Gwen's death actually brought her and Peter closer together. Peter and MJ's relationship was never really easy, with MJ at first not being very interested in the idea of a committed relationship, and wanting more to focus on her career as a performer and a model, as well as simply just having fun. However, after a few attempted proposals, MJ eventually did say yes, and the two were married for quite some time, even almost successfully starting a family together. And just as there are alternate realities where Gwen and Peter are together, there are many alternate realities where MJ and Peter are as well, and where they also have kids together, including the alternate worlds of MC2 and Renew Your Vows. However, in the main continuity, their marriage would not last after Mary Jane and Peter ultimately decided to sacrifice their relationship to Mephisto in order to save Aunt May's life, after she was shot in a hit that had been intended for Peter during Back in Black. The children of Spider-Man. While in the multiverse, Spider-Man actually has many children, in the main continuity, he hasn't really ended up with any, at least not currently and not as far as we know right now. He was almost a dad when he and his wife Mary Jane were pregnant with a daughter. Unfortunately, the young, soon-to-be parents were later made to believe, following delivery, that their daughter had actually been lost to them. In reality, we learned that the child had lived, but had actually been swept away as part of Norman Osborn, Green Goblin's own sinister plans. Despite the hope, however, that one day this child might return to her parents, honestly, I'm still a little hopeful of that, it would later be established that their daughter May had been disposed of later on at the order of Norman Osborn. In the MC2 reality, however, Peter and MJ's daughter does exist and was raised by both of her parents. She would grow up and develop her own spider-like abilities and powers, becoming known at first as the hero Spider-Girl, before adopting the mantle of Spider-Woman. This version of the character is also named May Parker, after Peter's beloved Aunt May, and is often referred to by her nickname of Mayday. Norman Osborn at one point also manipulated twins, Gabriel and Sarah Stacy, to believe that they were in fact the children of Spider-Man and Gwen, while also making them believe that Spider-Man was actually responsible for their mother's death. These children, however, were actually at first revealed to be the children not of Peter and Gwen, but of Norman and Gwen. I know. Fortunately, we'd later learn that this was also not true, and that they were actually clones created by Harry Osborn to torment his father Norman, having Norman's mind manipulated so that he would believe he had slept with Gwen, when in reality, he actually hadn't. Thank goodness. Thank you for fixing that, because it broke my brain. In the main continuity, there is also Master Matrix, who sees Deadpool and Spider-Man actually as his dads, funnily enough. Master Matrix is a life model decoy initially reassembled by Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker. After being activated, this LMD would come to see Deadpool and Spider-Man as his parents, and would also work alongside them as an ally. More recently, Matrix appeared in the Amazing Mary Jane series, where he befriended MJ after joining a film crew, and also helped to defeat the Savage Six.
Do you have anyone interesting in your family tree? Yeah, me neither. Although he is the last son of Krypton, Superman actually has a pretty detailed and expansive family tree. I'm Andrew Boyd, and today on Top 10 Nerd, I will be attempting to explain Superman's family tree. We'll be bouncing between continuities a bit, and the list is extensive, so for the sake of my sanity, we are not talking about any clones or alternate Earths. Just the family members bound together by blood or adoption. It's a lot to get through, so let's jump right in, starting with the House of L. This family tree is pretty extensive, so we're just going to stick with Earth 1 for this section. Although very little is known about them, Superman's most distant ancestors on the planet Krypton were Feln, his son Rugad, and his son Tomnu. No information is available on these ancestors, but Tomnu's son Arok is the first ancestor of note. Arok the Magnificent was a warlord who brought civilization to the planet Krypton with the help of a potion of strength. His magnificent strength caused enemy soldiers to pledge fealty to him, as they believed he was a god. In his final military campaign against the warlord Uved, he kidnapped Uved's daughter Milia in hopes of forcing a peaceful surrender. Milia fell in love with Arok, and the two were married and named Bethgar and Bithgar of Eurica. A quick explanation of that: a Bethgar and a Bithgar are the equivalent to a governor and a governess, and Eurica was a large continent on the planet Krypton. They had a child who they named Kal, which is Kryptonian for child, and the family adopted the surname El, which means of the star. Kal-El the First grew up to be the second Bethgar of Eurica. The Els ruled for over 20 generations, being mostly benign rulers with a few tyrants thrown into the mix to keep people on their toes. The next El whose name we know was Wabel, a tyrannic Bethgar. Wabel had two sons, Vadel and Hyrel. Vardel became the next tyrannical Bethgar, and after a quarrel between the two brothers, Hyrel was forced to flee his homeland. He had two sons, Japhel and Tyoel. Japhel was a prophet for the god Roa, who predicted a great flood that would smite all the wicked Kryptonians while sparing the righteous, making him Noah in space. When the flood came, Tio, who by the way was a zoologist, called down winged beasts to save the people. Japhel, Tol, and the survivors then set upon rebuilding their society, but not before Japhel made another prophecy predicting Krypton's eventual doom. Tol had descendants such as Bur-El, who was the friend of an inventor, Kilgore. Kilgore invented several important things on Krypton, such as the compass and the hourglass, the latter of which he invented so that the Kryptonians could keep track of the tides in order to dive off of cliffs into the water to harvest an algae called silten, before the Drotho, a bunch of giant birds, could beat them to the edible plant life. When no one else had faith in the old man's invention, Bur-El tested the hourglass by diving off the cliffs, proving that they had kept accurate time. Bur-El soon married Kilgore's daughter, Wedna, and they had 2 children, Tro-El and Val-El. Val-El was a great explorer who set out across the Dandahu Ocean and discovered Vathlo Island. His troubled brother was a member of his crew who eventually led a mutiny against Val-El. When this failed, Tro-El and his men were left on an uncharted island which became Bokos, the Island of Thieves. One of Val-El's descendants was an astronomer named Sul-El, who invented the telescope just in time to discover a starship coming towards Krypton. Krypton's first encounter with alien life resulted in the planet being enslaved by a race called the Vrangs. His son, Hatuel, led the slave revolt against the aliens and went on to invent the electric motor and the electromagnet. Hatuel's descendants included an inventor named Wirel, who invented Krypton's first audio recording equipment, and a scientist named Shuel, who was a respected mathematician and computer theorist. He had a daughter named Fedra Shuel, a legislator, and a son named Tharel, who reformed Krypton's criminal justice system. His son, Plen-El, was a respected novelist whose son Noxel was Krypton's greatest musical theater star. After this brief generational stop in showbiz, Noxel's son Phil-El became a gifted surgeon who pioneered several Kryptonian medical techniques. His son Sorn-El was an agriculturist who helped end world hunger on his planet. His son Im-El was an atomic scientist who revolutionized Krypton's industry standards. He had 2 sons, Pyrel and Uel. Uel was an influential priest, and Pyrel was the commander of the Kandor Kryptonopolis forces during the planet's last war, which he ended by developing a chemical weapon that made the opposing army become passive and interested in pursuing peace. His son, Tala-El, was one of the founding members of the Kryptonian Science Council, which united all of the separate nations of Krypton under one government, and he actually wrote the planet's constitution. His sons, Pim-El and Gam-El, were a detective and an architect who teamed up to stop a plot to sabotage the rebuilding of Krypton's capital city, Kryptonopolis. Gam-El had a son, Var-El, who figured out interstellar travel without the use of a spaceship and journeyed to Earth, where he was stranded and eventually died. This inspired his son, a scientist named Jor-El I, to develop an experimental hyperspace rocket and go to Earth to study the planet, taking extensive notes. Jor-El I had 3 children with his wife, Nimda Andor, 2 of whom are very important to the Superman mythos. Getting the less important sibling out of the way, we have Nim-El, who was a weapons manufacturer. He was present in the city of Kandor when it was shrunk and put in a bottle by the villain Brainiac. He and his wife, Dondra Clutan's son Don-El, became the police chief of the Bottle City until they were freed by Superman. He went on to create a new Kandor city on an outer dimensional world called Roken. Another of Jor-El I's sons was Zor-El, another scientist. When his brother discovered Krypton's impending doom, he tried to build a rocket for himself but ran out of time. When Krypton was destroyed, Zor-El's home, Argo City, was left intact and hurtled through space with its inhabitants. He married a woman named Allura Inzi, but they soon discovered that Argo City was turning into kryptonite. Zor-El managed to delay the city's demise by covering the planet in a lead shield. This shielding held for many years until a meteor shower caused its destruction, resulting in kryptonite radiation flooding the city. In order to save the life of his teenage daughter, Kara Zor-El, Zor-El placed Kara in a spaceship and sent it to Earth. Once the rocket was away, he managed to save several Kryptonian lives by transporting them into a dimension similar to the Phantom Zone, which he called the Survival Zone. They were trapped there for many years before eventually being rescued by Supergirl. Zor-El and his wife then joined the Kandorians on Roken. Their daughter, Kara Zor-El, is of course Supergirl. When she came to Earth, Superman agreed to train her to be a superhero, but weirdly made her live in an orphanage instead of letting her stay on his couch or in the Fortress of Solitude. She was eventually adopted by Fred and Edna Danvers, a rocket scientist and his wife, who had lost their son Jan and were hoping to adopt a child to help with their loneliness. Supergirl became a powerful hero in her own right before eventually dying in a fight with the Anti-Monitor in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and being erased from existence in the ensuing reboot of universes. She was later brought back to existence in the New Earth continuity with a slightly different origin, where she was Lana Lang's foster niece. Okay, so backtracking a bit, the third son of Jor-El I was Jor-El II. Jor-El was a gifted scientist who discovered the Phantom Zone and created the Phantom Zone projector, a device used to banish Krypton's criminals to the interdimensional realm. This secured Jor-El a spot on the Science Council. Due to an accident where a missile test had gone wrong and destroyed the colony on one of Krypton's moons, the Science Council banned all forms of space travel. Believing that Krypton's doom was approaching, Jor-El continued to develop experimental spacecraft in secret, hoping to evacuate the planet. When Krypton's destruction began, Jor-El realized he had run out of time. He and his wife, Lara Lor Van, the daughter of another Kryptonian scientist named Lor Van, decided to place their infant son Kal-El in one of the experimental rockets, and using the information collected by Var-El and Jor-El I, sent Kal to Earth, where he would not only survive, but thrive. They launched the rocket shortly before the planet exploded, killing them and everyone else on Krypton. Kal-El's rocket got to Earth, where it landed in Smallville, Kansas. He was found and adopted by the Kents, which leads us to the Kent family tree. The Kent family tree can be traced back to 6th century England, where a feudal lord named Sir Edmund Kent was killed in a jousting tournament by the evil Sir Oswald Bane. His son, Brian, inherited his lands and trained under a knight named Sir Grot, who trained him to be a fierce and cunning warrior. Fearing that Sir Bane would consider him a threat if he knew how skilled Kent was, he pretended to be meek and unskilled. One day, while in the Forest Perilous, he discovered a silver suit of armor, as well as a sword, shield, and a helmet which could conceal his identity. He donned the armor and became known as the Silent Knight, a heroic knight who never spoke and fought Sir Bane's forces. He had many adventures, sometimes working with King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, before eventually retiring and marrying Lady Celia Penbrook. The next known member of the Kent family tree is an American print shop owner from the 1800s named Silas Kent. He had two brothers, Ethan and William, but they're not really notable. Silas and his wife Abigail had 8 children: Belinda, Emma Lou, Jeb, Joel William, Jonathan, Lucy, and Owen. Silas was originally from Boston, but moved with his family to Lawrence, Kansas. Silas was a staunch abolitionist, which put him on the bad side of many of the locals, including a man named Luther Reed, with whom he got into frequent fights. Luther tried to run Silas and his family out of town, but Silas stood firm. When Silas discovered that pro-slavery legislators had rigged a territorial election, Silas used his printing press to print the entire Declaration of Independence on the front page of the town's newspaper. That night, Silas was shot by persons unknown, although many suspected Luther Reed to be the guilty party. Silas's son Jeb accused Luther of murdering his father and vowed revenge. This threat was pretext enough for the corrupt local sheriff to arrest Jeb with the intention of hanging him. He was rescued by his brother Nate. Jeb had a child named Taylor with a woman named Lily Beaumont, but he eventually joined up with the Jesse James gang. His brother Nate was eventually forced to bring him to justice, which resulted in a gunfight where Jeb and his gang were all killed. Nate married a woman named Mary and had children, which eventually led to the birth of their descendant, Sam Kent. Very little is known about Sam Kent, but in Superman Birthright number 3, Martha Kent describes him as a spiteful, needy man who worked hard to make his son feel stupid and insecure, although in this book he is referred to as Matthew Kent, so we'll have to pardon the continuity gaffe. In my opinion, Mark Waid is the best comic book writer of his generation, so I'll give him a pass. This time. Anyways, Sam had 2 sons named Harry and Jonathan, with a wife whose name we don't know. Harry was married to a woman named Sarah, but he died in an accident on the Kent farm when he fell under a thresher. Jonathan and his wife Martha were the couple that found the rocket that Kal-El came to Earth in, and they became his adoptive parents. Hey, Batman's mom is named Martha too! What a random coincidence that I hope is never an important plot point in a movie. Anyways, Jonathan and Martha named the baby Clark Kent, and they were instrumental in teaching him right from wrong, as well as helping him deal with his developing powers. Clark Kent, of course, grew up to be Superman, the Man of Steel. He had a few different love interests over the years, such as Lana Lang, but he eventually married his fellow reporter at the Daily Planet, Lois Lane, which brings us to the Lane family tree. This DC Comics family tree is mercifully much easier to keep track of, although there is some variation depending on which continuity you're working off of. In the Earth 1 continuity, Sam Lane and his wife Ella are the owners of a horse farm in Pittsdale, Iowa. In the New Earth continuity, Sam Lane is a general in the United States Army who had 2 daughters with his wife Ella. He had wanted sons and as a result was cold and distant, forcing his children to do extensive combat training and apparently treating them more like soldiers than his children. He was an enemy of Superman, believing that it was only a matter of time before Superman would turn on humanity. He faked his own death, appearing to sacrifice himself to defeat the villain Imperiex, but was later revealed to be alive and working with Lex Luthor in a secret government facility that is overseeing the actions of the villain Brainiac. After he used the villain Reactron to kill the recently freed Kandorians in the new Krypton story, his daughter Lois called him a monster, and the files proving his involvement were leaked online by Jimmy Olsen. He then took his own life to avoid the shame of being arrested and taken before an international court. In the Earth 2 continuity, his daughter Lucy is married to a man named George Tompkins and has a daughter named Susie, who is a precocious child who tends to make her Aunt Lois's life as difficult as possible. In the Earth 1 continuity, Lucy Lane is a flight attendant who is the on-again, off-again girlfriend of Jimmy Olsen. In the New Earth continuity, she was still a flight attendant until she was blinded in a hijacking. She became depressed and tried to jump off a roof, but was rescued by Bizarro. Bizarro had a weird powder coating his body, which somehow restored Lucy's sight. Like her Earth 1 counterpart, she dated Jimmy Olsen for a while, but eventually broke up with him and started dating another Daily Planet reporter named Ron Troop. Lucy became pregnant and married Ron, eventually giving birth to a son named Sam Troop. After Sam Lane faked his death, she joined the military and eventually was brought into Sam's inner circle in an attempt to deal with the new Kryptonians from Kandor. Sam outfitted Lucy with a mystical suit, which granted her powers, making her Superwoman. Posing as a Kryptonian, she infiltrated the Kryptonians, killing several of them. She was defeated by Supergirl and taken into custody, whereupon Lois disowned her as family. Which brings us to Lois. The older daughter of Sam and Ella, Lois Lane had no greater desire than to be a journalist. In the Earth 1 continuity, when Lois was in high school, she entered a contest being held by the Daily Planet, where whoever submitted the best news report would be awarded a job at the planet once they came of age. She found herself in competition with a young Clark Kent, and the two uncovered an evil scheme by a villain named Paul Corey. Lois submitted her report and won the competition. After graduating high school and minoring in journalism at Raleigh College, Lois was hired by the planet and became one of its best reporters. In the New Earth continuity, she visited the Daily Planet when she was 15, lied about her age, claiming to be 19, and asked Perry White for a job. Lucy spoiled her ruse, but Lois was undeterred, breaking into LexCorp to try and find a scoop good enough to warrant being given a job at the prestigious paper. Luthor caught her and had her searched, but she managed to hide an important paper in her mouth, gave it to Perry White, and was given the job. She and Clark Kent eventually got together, and he trusted her enough to marry her and reveal his secret Superman identity to her. The two were married for years, and briefly adopted General Zod's son Lor Zod, who they named Christopher Kent, but this was cut short when Chris was pulled into the Phantom Zone while helping Superman to defeat the General and his forces. Lois and Clark eventually had a biological child who they named John. At the age of 10, John began fighting crime with his father as the new Superboy. John became best friends with Damian Wayne, and the two became the Super Sons. After a journey through space with his time-displaced grandfather, John crash-landed on Earth 3 and was kept prisoner in a volcano for several years by the villain Ultraman. John eventually escaped and found his way home, where he discovered that what had been several years for him was only a few weeks on Earth. When his father left Earth to fight alien threats, John became the new Superman.
Wait a minute, Wolverine's family member created Weapon X? And Wolverine has an actual cousin who is a member of Canada's premier superhero team, Alpha Flight? Welcome back, Nerd Squad, it's me, Amanda. I guess when it comes to starting off a video where we are talking about the Wolverine family tree, it's best to start at its crunchy adamantium core, with Wolverine himself, aka Logan, aka James Howlett. Like Magneto, Wolvie has a bunch of names too throughout the years, including one of my favorites, Patch. And also like Magneto, he has a very tragic origin story, one that we've seen explained multiple times, both in the comics and in Wolverine Origins the film, which is a movie that happened. Oh boy did it happen. And also like Magneto, Wolverine started out as a villain in the comics, albeit much more briefly, and I guess more of an antagonist than a straight up villain, making his first appearance as the Hulk's adversary in the Hulk's own comic series, launching a rivalry that has actually spanned decades. Is it weird that I keep comparing Wolverine to Magneto? Yeah, let's stop doing that and jump into this family tree. Initially, all we knew of Wolverine was that he was a mutant, and in fact it was even suggested in the beginning that the adamantium claws that he possessed themselves were actually genetic. It wouldn't be till later that we'd actually learn the adamantium on his skeleton was actually added later on by Weapon X through a painful bonding procedure that few test subjects could survive, let alone benefit from, with the main time that we all kind of figured that out being when Magneto stripped the adamantium from him. That was a thing that was very memorable. Before he was Wolverine though, who was Wolverine? Well, if you ever asked Logan himself, he actually might struggle to answer this question due to all the tampering done to his mind, as well as years of both physical and emotional trauma that his brain had suffered and healed from. It's actually believed that the reason why Wolverine doesn't often remember things from his past is because his brain heals over painful memories, and that scar tissue and his healing factor's self-preservation instincts could contribute to memory loss. But also, Wolvie has been shot and stabbed in the head. A lot, which I think would mess with anybody's memories. If they could heal, definitely not. If you couldn't heal, well, you wouldn't have any memories because you'd be a dead guy. However, while Wolverine might struggle to remember his many pasts, fans of the characters likely won't, or fans that have read his many pasts anyways, including Origins. Before Wolverine was a superhero or even was known by the name of Logan, he was James Howlett. James grew up as a sickly child who actually was perhaps lucky that he even made it to the point of his mutant powers manifesting. Although I guess when you consider just how that happened and then everything that came after that and all of Logan's life, Logan might not see himself as being quite so lucky. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's head back to Wolverine's origins. James was raised as the youngest son of a wealthy couple, John Howlett Sr. and his wife Elizabeth Howlett, who lived in Alberta, Canada. However, in truth, he was actually the biological son of Elizabeth and the Howlett's groundskeeper Thomas Logan, born out of an affair between the two. At least, that was heavily implied. John Sr. Howlett may have still been James's biological father, but as I said, it is heavily implied that he was not. Still, John raised James as if he were his own anyway. Whether this was because he was not aware of his wife's affair or simply because he just felt it was the right thing to do, despite her infidelity, seeing James still as one of his own. We don't really know that much about John Sr. Howlett, although he seemed to have a kind heart, but it is implied that he was the one to deal the death blow to John Jr., James's older brother, doing so in defense of their mother, Elizabeth, after John Jr.'s powers, because he also had powers, manifested and he went into a rage. This likely weighed on John Sr. heavily. Also, yes, if you were wondering, Wolverine had a brother. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Elizabeth Hudson Howlett was Wolverine's mother. Hudson was Elizabeth's maiden name and would actually be a very important name when it came to Wolverine's story later in life, but we'll get back to that in a bit. And it seems likely that when it comes to Logan's X gene, he may actually get it from her side of the family or from his biological father's side, or a combination thereof, though more than likely I think it's from Elizabeth's side of the family. She gave birth to not one mutant, it turns out, but two! Though both sons may have been fathered by Thomas Logan, in the alternate reality of Earth 4011 that appears in Wolverine The End, it is stated that Elizabeth is where Wolverine gets his X gene from. Now of course that's not main continuity, but still some people feel like that's, could also apply to the main continuity. The traumatic and life-threatening experience she had with her first son is implied to be what caused her to be sent to a mental institution. Eventually though, she would return return, but life would forever be changed at the Howlett estate, with Elizabeth mostly preferring to hide in her room, even neglecting her younger son James as a result. As we have previously stated, young James also had an elder brother who passed away, John Jr. Howlett. John Jr. Howlett may have also truly been the biological son of Elizabeth and Thomas Logan, the groundskeeper, but we don't really know that for sure. What we do know is that John Jr. died young, after apparently also being born a mutant. It's believed that his father killed him out of defense of his mother, who he had attacked. Some believe to this day that John Jr. may even still be out there somewhere alive, possessing powers similar to Wolverine, despite the fact that Wolverine seemed to see his older brother during time spent in hell, which I think would be pretty crazy if we brought him back, but also I feel like if we haven't seen him at this point, where has he been? Aside from his elder brother who passed away, young James also had a half-brother in Dog Logan. Dog was the son of Thomas Logan and an unnamed woman. He grew up on the Howlett estate and became one of James's playmates along with Rose, who was brought in to live in the estate as a playmate for James while also being given serving duties as she got older. Dog at one point saved James's life after accidentally endangering it. However, Dog's feelings for Rose and forceful actions towards her, as well as his jealousy of James and all that he stood to inherit, drove a wedge between them as they grew up. Eventually, this division led Dog to attack James, causing him physical and emotional harm, with Dog and his father evicted from the estate as a result of this. Oddly enough, Dog somehow survived to the modern age, despite having been born like Wolverine in the late 19th century. At one point, he has a bunch of time diamonds, which I guess he could use to time travel, so this could be how he's lived so long, or perhaps his longevity is still as of yet an undefined power of his. We haven't seen him for a while, but still, pretty sure we saw him at least in like 2014 or something, so considering it's the 19th century and then we see him in a comic from 2014, that's a little what's happening there? We don't know. Thomas Logan is heavily implied to be the biological father of James Howlett, which seems to have been why he used Logan as an alias in the past. Although, as I've said previously, James's mind also became so addled that eventually he would not remember his true name as James Howlett, and would forget the connection of that name, Logan, to his biological father. So he might have just picked that name he thought randomly, but it wasn't so random. In fact, when Dog eventually comes to look for James and Rose years after they have fled the estate, James initially does not even recognize Dog or remember who he is or that he's a Logan. Thomas was a hard man, driven to drink and often behaving aggressively, especially towards his own son who lived with him, Dog. In fact, this is likely a big part of the reason that Dog turned out the way he did. After both Thomas and Dog were removed from the Howlett estate, Thomas snuck back onto the property, killing the Howlett servants and using Rose to gain access to Elizabeth's room, and of course bringing Dog along with him. There, Thomas attempted to get Elizabeth to run away with him before being confronted by John Sr., who Thomas then just killed. This is what caused James's mutant powers to manifest, as he sort of came into all this chaos, and in a blind fit of loss, desperation, and rage, he scarred Dog and killed Thomas with his bone claws. The trauma of the whole occurrence and its similarity to the tragic event of her first son proved too much for Elizabeth, who blamed herself and took her own life. James and Rose, also overwhelmed, chose to leave the estate, fleeing together. If you thought Thomas Logan was bad, well, I mean, you would be right, but while John Sr. seems like a well-meaning sweetheart by comparison, his own father was more akin to Thomas than his own son in terms of his cruelty. We don't know his name, but Mr. Howlett, or the Old Man as he was sometimes referred to, is the grandfather of Wolverine and the father of John Sr. He was the one who forged the Howlett name and created their fortune through unknown means. The Old Man was critical of John Sr. and his offspring, and may have even at one point threatened the life of young John Jr. because of his mutant gene. He constantly harped on John Sr., criticizing his parenting skills as he felt James was too weak and too soft. After Dog blamed Rose for the deaths of Thomas, John Sr., and Elizabeth, Mr. Howlett disowned James, although he did still help him and Rose escape town, and years later would actually come to regret sending his grandson away, giving Dog, then his heir and ward, information to help track James and Rose down once more so that he might actually make amends. However, Dog, of course, had some other plans. He was like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll totally do that. I'm not gonna go and try to kill this person who stands to potentially take an inheritance away from me that I just got. Wouldn't do that at all. Oh yeah, he definitely tried to do that. From the beginning almost, young James's life was steeped in tragedy. A tragedy so great, in fact, that he wouldn't even remember most of it as time went on. That's how great it was. Not even Rose, who also tragically died by accident at Wolverine's claws during a fight between him and Dog, after Dog had tracked him down with information information given to him by the old man. Wolverine would see Rose's spirit in visions when close to death, but not remember her or his own past. He would often mistake her for Jean instead, which kinda makes sense because Rose and Jean do look very similar. And Jean herself has also of course appeared in Wolverine's death visions in spirit form. Often too, because you know, half the time Jean happens to be dead in the comics it seems anyways, so that makes sense. However, this is only the beginning of Wolverine's tragedies. Tragedy would plague Wolverine throughout his family tree, even extending through his mother's heritage and her own family, the Hudsons. Elizabeth Hudson had two brothers, Elias and Frederick. Both survived their parents, who died tragically in a shipwreck. Everything is a tragedy when it comes to any story attached to Wolverine. Even his mother's family couldn't escape this comic book curse. Elias seems to have been the older brother, as he was the one who ended up running the family business, the Hudson Bay Company, which by the way is a real department store company that has strong ties and roots in Canada, so I kind of love that the Hudsons are related to the Hudson Bay Company. Wolverine even at one point unknowingly works for his uncle Elias, who was later driven to take his own life, shortly after Wolverine left. Mental health seems to be something that the Hudsons struggled with throughout their history, probably something Wolverine should watch out for. Actually, I feel like Wolverine has also struggled with that, so I mean we all struggle with that, so fair enough. Frederick, however, ended up working with the Canadian military, overseeing a training facility, a facility that ended up being used by notorious and often confusing Wolverine villain Romulus, who was retconned to have been the mysterious figure making Wolverine's life even more tragic the whole time. Like he even needed help in that department at all, Romulus, jeez. And of course, as Romulus enters the equation, here is where Hudson's involvement with Wolverine gets really weird, but kinda great, but really weird. Logan ended up at the military training facility where Victor Creed, aka Sabretooth, and Silas Burr, aka Cyber, and currently known as Hornet, would also be. Under orders from Frederick, who did not know that Logan was his nephew, Burr was instructed to make Logan's life living hell in order to turn him into a loyal killer. Another of Romulus's agents, Janet, was also used to manipulate Logan through having him fall in love with her, but not of course so she could persuade Logan to do what she wanted, as you can kind of do with people that, you know, love you. You can kind of convince them of things, but unbeknownst to her, so she could be basically fridged, aka killed, thereby motivating Logan in one way or another. Another classic Romulus plot. Frederick himself would later be killed on Romulan's orders by his great-nephew Daken, aka Akahiro, the son of Wolverine. Frederick never had any children with his wife, but did have an illegitimate son with his secretary, whom she vengefully named Frederick Hudson II in order to hurt Frederick's relationship with his wife. Take that, Frederick. His secretary Caitlin MacDonald took her own life sadly shortly after giving birth. While Frederick didn't do much of note in his own life, he did have three sons who are pretty relevant: Truett, Victor, and James. Frederick II himself died young as the result of a bar brawl, which is a pretty fitting way to go for anyone who's related to Wolverine. Truett Hudson, often referred to simply as Wolverine's cousin, though more specifically Wolverine's first cousin once removed, is one of the most important of the three. Truett is also known in the comics as the Professor, and while he is also bald, we are not talking about that professor, not Charles, aka Professor X. Instead, Truett was the Professor, also known by the alias Professor Thornton, who became tied to the Weapon Plus program, likely inspiring it as a result of stumbling into a lab in a World War II German camp that actually belonged to, get this, Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister. What a strange connection I never thought would exist, and yet it does. From there, Weapon Plus would later spawn the creation and project known as Weapon X, on their journey to create new super soldiers. This was following the success of Project Rebirth, which led to the creation of Captain America, who was labeled by the program as Weapon 1. The Professor would later be put in charge of brainwashing Team X operatives, among them Logan included, and would be known as Director of the Weapon X program. Yeah, that's the thing. That is literally his first cousin once removed, who was running that program. Truett actually also has ties to Dracula, another famous Wolverine enemy. Truett himself would be killed, seemingly and surprisingly, by Silver Fox, who at this point was believed to have actually been alive this whole time, and also now be evil and working for Hydra. And if you don't remember Silver Fox, she's one of Wolverine's first loves. However, in this reality, this probably wasn't actually Silver Fox, but a mutated clone of her. At least, all us Silver Fox fans are hoping that's what happened. Hopefully it's not really Silver Fox. To this day, I think a lot of people say, that's a clone. Victor is the middle child of Frederick II's. He himself was also manipulated by Romulus, because isn't everyone? He acted as Romulus's right-hand man and was shown to be extremely durable and strong, although I don't know if we ever found out if he was a mutant or not. Victor was also born mute as well as blind. He met his end at the hands of Wolverine. Continuing right along with the three McDonald Hudson brothers, we also have James Hudson. That's right, Guardian of Alpha Flight. Andrew, are you proud of me? I found a way to work Alpha Flight into this video. Although considering Wolverine's history with the team, that really shouldn't be hard in general to do while talking about him, because he himself has also, been a pretty good ally and sometimes team member of Alpha Flight. But anyways, this isn't about Wolverine's life story. This video is about his relatives and his family connections. Enter James Hudson, also Wolverine's cousin and half-brother to the villainous Truette. Half-brother because all three brothers actually had different mothers. James was the youngest of the three, which means I got to save the best for last. Before Guardian was Guardian, James Hudson developed a suit for Amcan Oil Corporation to be used to help locate underground oil deposits. However, after he learned his suit was going to be sold to the US military and used as a weapon, which he was not here for, he destroyed its plans and stole the helmet of the suit, making it unusable. He then went to the Canadian government for help and protection from Amcan Oil. He would go on to become founder of Department H and the leader and founder of Alpha Flight. James Hudson and his wife, Heather McNeil Hudson, aka Vindicator, would also become fast friends with technical relative James Howlett, ever since they ran into a feral Logan on their honeymoon as seen in Alpha Flight issue number 33, which has a flashback to that. James and Heather have one daughter together, Claire, who would be, I think, a cousin twice removed to Wolverine. So that's also a thing. John Sr. and Elizabeth aren't the only ones with relatives relevant to Wolverine's history though. Thomas and the Logans also have an extensive past, and at least one relative that you might find at least interesting. Folkburn Logan. If Wolverine were to run his DNA through someplace like Ancestry.com, he'd learn that 1. He probably has a lot more kids than he ever knew about, and 2. That he was also related to Folkburn Logan. Folkburn lived back in the 11th century and is referred to by his fellow soldier and friend as the last pagan, living in London, England. Folkburn runs into Thor and the Horsemen of the Apocalypse during a fight between them, and is saved by Thor himself, just as he begins to pray to the old gods, hilariously, which I love, as seen in Uncanny Avengers issue number 6. While this pretty much covers all of Logan's family when it comes to where he comes from and his origins, there's a lot more tragedy ahead for us to explore when it comes to romance and his own offspring. We're running a little short for time on this video, so I'm going to briefly cover some of the major wives/loves and children we've come to know as related to Wolverine in the main comic book continuity of Earth 616. But if you enjoyed this video and you want a specific video about Wolverine's kids, let us know in the comments, or if you would rather perhaps something a little different, such as hearing me attempt to explain the history of Weapon X, or attempt to explain Mr. Sinister's family tree instead, both of which would probably also be a lot of fun. Be sure to let us know. When it comes to Wolverine's wives, there are two main ones that stick out to me. One of whom he was actually married to, another he was almost married to, but I think we can still count her. She's a pretty big deal. Other than Jean Grey and his weakness for redheads, the major loves of Wolverine's life I would say would be Mariko Yoshida, his fiancée, and Itsu, his wife. Although Wolverine was also shown to be married to the ancestor of a person named Hoshiko in the story Aftermath in Wolverine Exit Wounds, and was once also married to Ophelia Sarkissian, aka Viper. That's a thing that happened. With Mariko, their love did not produce any offspring, but it was a strong love regardless, and they did have a foster daughter together, so that's a thing. Mariko was introduced in X-Men issue 118, and we'd come to know her as the daughter of Lord Shinjin, the leader of Clan Yoshida, a crime syndicate in Japan. Mariko is also a cousin to Mutant Sunfire, which was how she first met Wolverine. The two fell in love and eventually ended up engaged after the death of Mariko's father. However, due to the manipulations of Mastermind, their wedding would be called off. Later, it would be back on but delayed until Mariko felt she had made right the wrongs that Mastermind's influence over her had caused. She died before they could be married though. While she would be resurrected much later, her and Wolverine's relationship would never really recover. Itsu is the wife of Logan, who he met, fell in love with, and married during his time training with Bando Saburo in Japan. Itsu became pregnant but was unfortunately assassinated by by Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, before her child could be born. Initially, it was actually believed that their offspring did not survive, but later we learned that thanks to the power of the baby's X gene, it actually did survive. The baby was retrieved by Romulus, who left him on the doorstep of a well-off couple that would adopt him. However, Romulus would also manipulate this baby, named Akihiro, but cruelly nicknamed Daken, and now known by the codename Fang, to grow up to hate his father. His biological father, Wolverine, that is. Daken would attempt to destroy Logan while working for the Red Right Hand, seeking out those who were Wolverine's offspring that he either never knew existed or had forgotten about due to, once again, much tampering with his mind and just overall memory loss, and using those relatives as weapons against their father. This group was known as the Mongrels. They died at Wolverine's hands without him knowing of their true origin till after he'd killed them all. Tragedy. At one point, Daken and Wolverine would be pitted against one another by the machinations of Sabretooth, leading to Daken tragically being drowned by his own father in a puddle. But don't worry, he returned and later would reconcile with his dad, and now he isn't even known by the name Daken, but prefers to be addressed as Akihiro or Fang. Other prominent offspring of Logan's from the main continuity include Laura Kinney, aka X-23, who is also now known as Wolverine, his daughter and also his female clone, Gabrielle Gabby Kinney, aka Scout, a clone of Laura, who is also seen as Wolverine's daughter, and Amiko, his adopted daughter, who has spent a lot of time being raised by Wolverine's good friend Yukio, and previously was raised in part by Wolverine's love and fiancé Mariko, prior to her death of course.